It's great to see the latest exhibition on screen film about to appear in Australian cinemas in May, a film called Pissarro, the Father of Impressionism. And it's my great pleasure to talk again to the director and co-writer of Pissarro, Father of Impressionism, David Bickerstaff. David, welcome again to Movie Metropolis.
Hello, Peter. Yeah, thank you for having me back. It's great to see you again.
And as you were saying just before we started recording, you're in Ireland at the moment, and I gather things are starting to settle a bit with COVID and everything.
Yeah, things seem to be normalizing quite a lot over here. People not wearing masks so much. It's encouraged to wear a mask, but it's not mandatory anymore. I do a lot of flying between Ireland and London, and it seems quite normalized. There's a few procedures, and definitely London, traveling on the tube and everything, it seems to be back to normal, which I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I have had COVID, and it was just like having a bad cold, but it wasn't the dreaded thing. But then I've been vaccinated 3 times as well. So it's I think there's a process people are going through. In fact, my elderly mother-in-law, who's 93, she was the first to get COVID in our family, and she just had a couple of little sniffles, nothing else. And me and my wife, we suffered from it much worse than she did. Yeah. But so I think it's an interesting time and interesting to see how it all works out. Eventually it will become the norm in our life, as it is already, as it has been for the last few years, and how we deal with it is quite interesting. It affects filmmaking across a lot of the films that, particularly Pissarro. We were all packed, ready to go to do the interviews in Basel at the Kunstmuseum, where the exhibition is also, and they were excited to receive us. But literally they had the Omicron purge came through, and Switzerland said, if you come to Switzerland, you'll have to self-isolate for 14 days, which of course made it absolutely impossible. So we had to scramble around, reorganize, find a film crew, and then I had to zoom in remotely and do all the interviews and the filming sort of remotely, which was not ideal, but essentially that was just the way of the world. Luckily, I could do the Ashmolean because that's obviously in England, but which is where the main part of the film is based. But essentially, yes, it's an interesting way of making films. It's not my preferred way of doing it, but that's the way we have to do it. I mean, I did manage to get to France and do film Rouen and through Le Havre and coming down through towards Paris along the Seine, which is where Camille Pissarro went to Pontoise, went to his studio, which still exists in Erigny, and which was fantastic opportunity to go in there. The people have preserved it and not done anything to it, the current owners, private owners, so it's not open to the public. So we were very lucky to get in there. And but then I went to go and do the interviews with Duran-Ruel, Claire Duran-Ruel in Paris, and then they had another wave of restrictions come through. So it's been a funny old project, but we get there in the end, and now we're about to release it to the world.
Isn't that interesting? Because it certainly doesn't show on screen. I could not tell whatever you did remotely, whatever you did in person, whatever. It just all seems so seamless when you see it on screen.
I guess that's the magic of obviously I was there, I was remotely, so I was directing it, I was in charge of, and I'd be asking the cameraman to frame it in a certain way to match up the way that I would film it. Normally I would be operating the camera and doing things like that, or have a cameraman, Hugh Hood, who I've been working with for years and years and years. And so we have a language, we have an understanding of the way the films are constructed. But then we work with a very good post-production house who magically bring it all together and make it look unified and give it the beautiful cinematic feeling and that cinematic look. And of course, the sound has come from various sources as well, but we take a lot of care and a lot of attention to the sound, and we sort of go into the dubbing studios and balance everything out, because some of the galleries are very voluminous, so they feel very empty and sort of echoey, and other places are very sort of sound dampened, and then you've got exteriors and things like that. So it's quite an interesting jigsaw puzzle that we go through in post-production, but it's always worth it when you see it in the end on the big screen.
Exactly. It is certainly quite a process, and always looks great on the big screen. So Pissarro is such an interesting painter, and so prolific in terms of the output he had, and being regarded as the founder of Impressionism. What were some of the issues you had? Because there's usually, you have letters, you have voiceover, you have a number of things that you add to the way that you film these exhibition on screen films. But what were some of the issues you faced in really delving into Pissarro's story?
I guess Pissarro, for most people, is probably the least well-known Impressionist, but he's probably, which you find out if you see the film, he's probably the most influential of the Impressionists on other Impressionists, so on other painters. And he was also a very generous man in the way that he was the eldest in the group, so he's the oldest Impressionist, but he was also always gave a lot of time to younger painters like Cézanne, like Gauguin, and would bring them on and encourage them to paint. And essentially, he was also in all 8 of the exhibitions, the Impressionist exhibitions, which means he was the one that stood the ground and really defended the principle of what the Impressionists were about. Not to pander to the salon and to authority, not to be, sucked in by the dealers and what have you, to stick to your guns and to really just go for what you believe in and to paint the way that you want to paint. And I guess getting that across on the film, that he was an innovator, that, to try and reveal some of the things that a lot of people don't know about Pissarro, because he was an anarchist. So he was a very interesting guy. He was actually not French. He was born in the Danish Caribbean. And so therefore he had a Danish passport, but he spent, he left the Caribbean when he was in his mid-20s and went to Paris, never went back. But essentially it's sort of, not many people realize that. But he was and he had 8 children. He was very much a family man. There was but he was always poor. So he was a little bit like Van Gogh. He was that sort of person who was determined to do his art and be true to his art, and not to give in and pander to the dictates of society or the bourgeois or whatever. So it made it very interesting. We had a head start, of course, because the Ashmolean Museum, they hold the family archive. So Lucien Pissarro, Camille's eldest son, went to London, I think in his late 20s, to learn English and to be an artist. He was an artist as well, as were all the sons of Pissarro. Excuse me. And when Pissarro died, they had this great correspondence between themselves, Lucien and Camille, because he was the eldest, and they talked about everything, about how they painted, about the local gossip, about how the war was affecting them, how during the Dreyfus affair, how anti-Semitism was rising, and how it affected them. They wrote about all sorts of things. So it gives you a fantastic portrait of a man and his relationship with his son, but also it gets a sense of the historic processes that were going on in France during the time that he was there, and what it was affecting his painting. He talks about other artists, what they're doing, what they're doing, whether they're doing good stuff, whether they're doing bad stuff. He was very good friend, best friends basically with Monet. So he was always talking about Monet, and they had a bit of a rivalry going on there, who was doing what. And in fact, going to Rouen was because he'd seen what Monet had done in Rouen with his cathedrals, repeating the paintings of cathedrals. So there was a lot of the dialogue between the artists, even though he was the only one who really did all the Impression exhibitions. So we had access to these letters. We had access to fantastic curator Colin Harrison, who's the main thread of the narrative. He holds the thread, the storyline in the film. But you know, it was fascinating seeing his letters. They're beautifully written and everything. So that was a good head start for us in be able to get underneath the skin of Camille Pissarro.
Yes, yeah, exactly, and you certainly do that in the documentary. Just harking back, you talked about Dreyfus. It's interesting that Pissarro was Jewish, and even though he wasn't really a practicing Jew, he was sort of agnostic, as you say in the film.
Yeah.
His wife was Catholic,
Yeah.
and I found it interesting how the Dreyfus affair revitalized his Jewish heritage. And so I wonder how much of that also imbued his paintings.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's a bit of a debate about how, I mean, he was very proud of his heritage, his Jewish heritage, but he was an anarchist, so he was not prone to sort of being reverential to any sort of institution, or so institutional religion or institutional anything, to tell you the truth. And he didn't, he had 8 children. He married a Catholic. I mean, so, and he never imposed his Judaism on his children or anything like that. But amongst his group, he was known as the Jewish painter, you know, that Jew, and particularly people, anti-Semitic type artists or friends of his who were prone to anti-Semite behavior, like Degas and Renoir. They would be quite openly sort of abusive and, you know, sort of be quite nasty to him, to the fact that Degas, who was very close to him because they did a lot of experimentation with printing, and they were good friends, but with Dreyfus, they completely fell out. And when Dreyfus was exonerated, Degas just couldn't take it on board. He thought it was wrong and decided not to talk to Pissarro anymore. And in fact, didn't even go to his funeral, said he had a cold, you know. And so it did create a lot of fractiousness within the group. But Pissarro, being Pissarro, he was more concerned about preserving the dialogue in art. So he was slightly forgiving of these other artists who had these perverse views, which is very generous of him, but he did suffer from it a lot. And, you know, the people, he was amongst their group known as the anarchist and as the Jew, which is, you know, an interesting label that he had to deal with.
Okay, how interesting to hear that. Impressionism is such a key art portraiture or art movement. And I'm always intrigued as to the way art movements wax and wane, and how Impressionism was popular at one stage and then it lost its popularity, etc. How are these things determined? I'm always quite intrigued as to the artistic process and how people regard them.
Yes, well, Impressionism began because it was a reaction against the traditional way an artist would show their work, which was in the salon. And the salon was a juried exhibition, so you had to sort of, they were looking for heroic paintings, they were looking for, you know, there was a hierarchy of what was considered good for the salon. The Impressionist painters were much more interested in almost the English country landscape tradition, you know, by Constable and what have you, where the painting was much more expressive. And also the Barbizon school artists, you know, the realist, French realist artists like Corot, like Millet, you know, they were experimenting a lot with paint and being much more free, going into the open. So the Impressionism was born out of this tradition. So it was a reaction against the salon. So, and they had a Paul Durand-Ruel, the dealer, who was dealing with these French realist painters. He was already selling them, became very interested in the Impressionist painters who were experimenting. And the first exhibition was basically a collective idea, which is also a very Pissarro thing, is to have a collective of artists. Let's all get together against authority. Let's have a show. Let's find a space. Then they found a photographer, Nadar led his big studio space, and they had their first exhibition, all self-generated. Well, of course, the critics were curious and they came along, but they completely, you know, they completely slashed it. They didn't like it. Some critics were very supportive, like Zola and people like that. So that it wasn't all bad news, but essentially it wasn't until about the fourth or fifth exhibition that it all started to take off. And there'd been a change in personnel in between, you know, they weren't all the same artists. But essentially, Impressionism, it's a funny the way, even Camille Pissarro, even when Monet became successful with Impressionism, Pissarro wasn't. So just because you're an Impressionist doesn't mean you're going to be successful. Some artists took off, some artists didn't. And it wasn't until Pissarro started to do these sort of aerial views of cityscapes and things like that, that he started to have some sort of success. And they're beautiful paintings. They're in the film. They're absolutely gorgeous paintings. And he has a shift. And this actually comes right at the end of his life. So he spent his whole life struggling. But there's no magic. I think it's all down to market forces. The way that I kind of addressed this in the previous film, The Danish Collector, where all of a sudden Impressionism started to take off. It became collectible. And one person was saying, well, I've got myself 3 Monets, and the other collectors, well, I'm going to get myself 6. You know, there was an element of competitiveness. It was the rise of the dealer who was always advising people what to buy, and they started to shift and say, look, I recommend you start buying up these Impressionists before they get too expensive. So there was a bit of a market force going on there. And you know, by the early 1900s, it was quite a popular thing, particularly by Americans. They absolutely loved it. And so they started, once the Americans started to buy it up, the Europeans, who were a lot much slower, they started to catch up. Having said that, the English were one of the first people, you know, the English collectors were some of the first people to buy Impressionism, because Durand Ruel was in London when he first met the Impressionists and started to have a show there. So Impressionism sort of started in London and not in Paris, even though most people think that it's, you know, it is a French art phenomenon, but it's an interesting where the market actually picked it up and sort of moved it forward.
So interesting to hear the complexities of the art world. It's it really
it's the same now. It's exactly the same now.
There you are.
Yeah.
And what is so interesting too, because Pissarro lived in the 19th century, you were able to also show some of the photos that were taken of him and of the relevant period as well, which adds that extra dimension, I suppose, to telling his story.
Yes, we were very lucky because in the archive, they do have a lot of family photos, and particularly when he goes to Erigny, where it becomes more of his family home, he stops moving around so much. So there's more time for photographs to be taken. And there are fabulous photographs, and there's like family group photographs, and you could see, you know, how big his family were. You know, his eldest son was in his late 20s and he had like a baby child, you know, so the range of children was incredible. But the interesting thing about the photographs is it made me think, because sometimes in our films we will have an actor who would be silently recreating a sense of the artist, you know. And I did think, should I do this with Pissarro? But then I thought, no, the photographs and the letters, what he writes is so powerful. And so I thought, I'm going to try and find a French voice to speak the words. And so it's not an English voice, you know, doing a Shakespearean version of Pissarro. Tried to get more of an authentic French accent, French voice. And I think it works because you look at he's got the range of his pictures, of his photographs. And then you can see he did a few self-portraits and people have done other portraits of him. You get that, and then you really do build up this idea of the man, you know, through the artwork and through the archive photographs. I think that works for me quite well. I was quite pleased with the way that came across.
I agree. It sounded really good, and it worked in well with the construction of the narrative. So yeah, no, that was fine. And as always, there's always a lovely music score. Asa Bennett has produced another lovely music score to underscore what you're presenting.
Yes, it's always a great, it's always a fantastic relationship with ASA. I mean, we do struggle at the beginning because we try to do something different. So we don't want it to sound all the same. And in fact, I was at a film festival in Bulgaria the other week, and I was showing The Danish Collector, and then they were showing the film I made on Lucian Freud, which of course have got completely different soundtracks, but they were both made by ASA. And so it was great to hear the difference, and I think the Danish Collector just the Pissarro's, it just continues that tradition of just taking it on to another sort of, hard to say. It's music scoring is a very interesting sort of dynamic that comes to the film, and I'm always very excited when the music comes together and things it's like a glue, seems to bring things together and makes transitions really interesting and allows you just to sit and look at paintings and look at landscape without too much chat and too much dialogue, So, I'm always grateful to Asa for what he comes up with. It's always a great partnership.
Yes. No, it all comes together really well. Now, the film's releasing in Australia later in May. I gather it's already been released in Europe, overseas, etc.
No, it's going to be the same time, similar time, I think. So it's all going to happen at the same time this time. And I think the reason for this is because the exhibition at the Ashmolean is still on. So the people in the UK, the Ashmolean were very keen that the film came out while the exhibition was still on, so people can go and see the film, but they can then think, oh, I'm going to go see the exhibition as well, so, or vice versa. So, or they've seen the exhibition, they want to go and see the film. So I think that's the reason that the dates are much closer this time round. So it's hard to know about the timing of these things because, particularly with COVID, sometimes it's about where distributors think, okay, yeah, that film's really going to fit in our spring or our sort of autumn sort of programming. It's an area that I'm not that much involved in, but there's always reasons behind why things get released at certain times.
But the good thing is that people are now flocking back to cinemas, it seems, worldwide. And that
I hope so. Yes, I really hope so. Yeah, I went to the cinema. I actually went the other day, last night or something, and I went and saw a film. Obviously, I've seen in the film festivals, and I was thinking, yes. I said to the audience when I did a Q&A, I said, please come back to the cinemas. This is the way you must watch films. It's just brilliant to see it in the cinema, and I was so happy to be back in that place. It was great.
Yeah, that is great. And the Ashmolean is very interesting. I didn't know much about it, but of course it's associated with Oxford University. Is that right?
It is the museum of the Oxford University, and the collection is the oldest public museum in England. So it's old, even older than the British Museum. So, and it has a collection that's incredible. It goes from Egyptology all the way through to 19th century paintings, of course, and collections of like Pissarro's, and they also have a contemporary art program as well, where they commission artists to integrate with the collection. It's a fantastic museum if anyone's in Oxford to go and see it. But it's a bit like the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, which is the Museum of Cambridge University. And the Fitzwilliam is the gallery that we did the Degas film around, and that's when we made our Degas film. So I think these museums are outside of London, and I think it's good to get out of London and go to these other museums because they have the most incredible collections, and they're very, very good people to work with too. Very nice, very helpful, very open access to, their remit is about learning and scholarship and exchange. So it's great that we're able to work with them.
Excellent stuff. Yeah, I fully agree with you. So, David, I'm always intrigued. What's coming up next for you?
Oh, that's a good question. There's a few things in the pipeline. We're in discussion. Well, we've already filmed at the Ashmolean. They did do during lockdown. They managed to get on an exhibition about Tokyo and art and photography, and it looks at Tokyo from the very inception of Tokyo back in the Edo period, and it goes all the way up to modern interpretations of Tokyo by some of the 60s photographers and protest photographers that were happening in Japan. Fabulous exhibition, absolutely very highly praised. And we did film the exhibition with the intention of making our next film about it. But there's a bit of a question about how we can go to Japan or not, or anything like that. So, but then, you know, for me, that's the sort of thing I'm working on at the moment. And with there's some other little things in the pipeline that I can't quite reveal at the moment, but because these are always sensitive, these negotiations. But of course, Exhibition on Screen are bringing out, there's some new films are coming out about Hopper and about Mary Cassatt, who was a great impressionist, female impressionist painter. And so they keep coming, but there's some of them that I'm not directing. I might be working on as a camera person or something like that. But essentially, the Exhibition on Screen brand and the Exhibition on Screen films, there's still lots in production happening at the moment.
Oh, yes, yes. Now, I spoke to Phil Grabsky a little while ago on another.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And of course, you co-wrote Pissarro with him, didn't you?
Yes, that's right. Yes. No, that's always an interesting process. You know, I mean, we can't all write at the same time, so I tend to start it off, you know, with the research. And Phil's very well informed. He's done lots of impressionist exhibitions himself, you know, and worked on exhibition and impressionist films. So then we exchange books and we exchange, you know, thoughts, and we talk about the narrative structure. And then, you know, I'll have the first go because I've done the interviews and things like that. And then he'll come through and say, no, we need to restructure it. So it is a good partnership. And he has quite a different eye to me. So it's good that we can keep each other in sort of check, as it were, to make sure that the film makes sense and that it's a powerful story. You know.
Absolutely. And so Pissarro, the father of Impressionism, will be in Australian cinemas later in May. And just briefly mention the Seventh Art website and how people can get access to more information about all of your productions.
Yeah, so the Seventh Art Productions is the actual production company, and they have their own website. So that's seventh, the word seventh hyphen art.com, or is it .co? I've forgotten now. Oh dear. Oh, anyways, if you put in Seventh Art Productions, you'll find it. But Exhibition on Screen is Exhibition on Screen, all one word, .com. And then you will come across all the films that we've made in the past. You can download them, you can stream them, you can get DVDs, you can find out where they're going to be shown, because just because they have a launch in the season, they actually get shown around the world. I'm always surprised that something pops up in Google alerts saying that, you know, Freud's shown in Atlanta or somewhere around the world. So it does they do come up in cinemas, and over here, of course, in the UK, they do come up on Sky Arts, who have taken 50-minute versions of the films, actually. So the full impact is best seen in the cinema, but you can get shorter versions of the films through Sky Arts in the UK.
Well, the next best thing to going to the galleries or seeing the paintings in person is to see them on film, and Exhibition on Screen does a great job in bringing that to the world.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. That's exactly what we try to do. And not only, I mean, the institutions see it very much as legacy, because the exhibition comes for like 2 or 3 months and then it goes. And that's it. No one will ever see it again. So apart from in a catalogue, or they can go and see this film, which really unpacks and also takes you beyond the gallery walls and takes you on a journey to the locations of where these artists actually made this great work.
Exactly. It's so much value added. We've been speaking to David Bickerstaff, the director and co-writer of Pissarro, the father of Impressionism, in Australian cinemas later in May. And David, as always, thanks so much for talking with me.
My pleasure, Peter. Thank you very much.
All the best. Bye-bye.
See you later. Bye.